and my view is, tino rangatiratanga can be achieved well before 2040. You can move on it straight away. Next point is that I don't believe a constitutional debate will make it happen. Third point, I think this needs to be seriously considered. Are constitutions really a good option? Because I suspect the Westminster parliamentary system is better. So before you chuck me out of this room, I'll explain why. I'm a historian. I study history. The law's another matter, but what I know from the parliamentary system in the United Kingdom, it's built on an incremental system of change, and Parliament is ultimately built on what Dicey called long-standing conventions. Parliament operates by conventions. It's an English system, but here's the point. It is an English system based on custom. The Westminster system is built on long-standing conventions, which is Western custom. It's English custom. Their laws and their systems have been built up over centuries. The reason why I'm taking you in this direction, the United States and constitutions are when the settler societies turn their back on their past. The United States Constitution was built on the rejection of the monarchy because they did not want to pay taxes. In other words, the obligations of paying a tax, which is a responsibility we all have, was rejected. But the thing about accepting constitutions by colonial states is they reject their past. When I hear in New Zealand is wanting to be post-colonial, my first view is the colonisers right in front of me and the colonised right here. What they're really saying is they want to reject their obligations to their own people in the United Kingdom. They don't want to do these things. Now, that's fine because I understand people want to evolve, but our ancestors signed a treaty. It's a treaty that has convention in New Zealand law that they wish to reject because of a nonsense called democracy. Now, I'm just putting that there for you to think about because, in my view, it can be built, but it's quicker than going through a constitutional process. But we have to answer some basic questions and not get caught in the dialogue that constitutional debates go through. First question, because I want to deal with the Mai Chen question later, where does tino rangatiratanga sit? If we go through the constitutional process of democracy, we'll be told it sits with the people. No, it doesn't. In my village and in our hapu, we are very clear at where tino rangatiratanga and mana sits. One place. The people in Otako knew that as well. When Taiero came to the Kotahitanga conference, his statement was very, very clear. Ko au te upoko me te hiku o tōku motu. I'm the head and the tail of my island. I'm the alpha, I'm the omega. Ngaito wouldn't even challenge that. The other point from our upoko in tuahuriri is iahu mai oku ture. I oku tupuna ia tuahuriri. My laws come from my ancestor. We need to discuss this because each hapu and whānau and iwi will have its own variation of where rangatiratanga will sit. Kingitanga, I expect we know, I won't assume. Tuwharetoa, I think we know, I won't assume. Same with Te Arawa. Kahungunu have the pepeha he tangata noa. But what we do know is that the office will never sit in a corporation. It will never sit with an elected official. It will never sit with a tribal politician because those things are from whakapapa. And on a larger scale, I have to give the tribal, well, I'll give our tribal position. We simply won't be bowing our head to a village grocer elected as the head of state. Okay, the next one that we have to deal with is what is it? What is tino rangatiratanga? Look, I know we know what we think it is because at the moment it's a dream. But if we are going to go to the next stage of building, we have to give clear directions to our people on what you want to secure. So when we want rangatiratanga, is it over a customary fishery? Is it to remove Crown title? Or is it about housing consents and establishing your own system of government? Whatever it is, it has to be precise because the people who are the engineers need to take those directions and build it, which is why I think it's an incremental process. Now, our village is going through this process. We're securing territory, but we all have to make the decisions. What's the target? Is it a small objective that you can win, but no one cares about? For an example, we just said to our local council, our cemetery is getting full. We're not going to ask permission, we'll just do it. No one's going to argue. You could go for a big issue by removing Crown title, and I don't know why you couldn't, because the Crown certainly didn't. But is that bar too high? Or is it about simply taking Māori land and applying your own consent process as a government in your takiwā to build houses? Now, that question leads to a lot of sub-questions. If it's about building and consenting authorities on Māori land, what are you going to do with all those absentee owners? You've got an acre, 400 owners, not appointed, not succeeded since the turn of the century 100 years ago. So these are all the questions because that's where the precision's needed to build tino rangatiratanga. Now, we've implemented this in our rūninga where we've identified small things that we can simply assert our authority, because the point we need to understand is Crown sovereignty is actually a grey space. There's lots of grey spaces that you can occupy and we can occupy with an assertion of sovereignty. Last question, how do we implement it? Who's going to implement it? Whether we like it or not, we need institutions to implement, to take the directions, to implement a system of change and government. Now, here's the point about government. It's not overly concerned, well, it loves to deal in the abstract because it controls the language. But government is really about detail. And I understand why Ani asked us not to deal with the real issues, because that's horrible. And I think I understand the point. But ultimately, what strangulates and corrodes Māori is the detail in local government in doing what you want to do. You can't build, or we can't build in our reserves because it's controlled and strangled by three things: local government, central government, Māori Land Court. Everyone controls it. So here's the last thing I'll say about tino rangatiratanga and what it is. We've come with this view. There are three things that define tino rangatiratanga. Iwi hapu must have regulatory authority. Why? Because we've had a very good job over the last 20 years of getting taonga back. Point, we don't regulate it. Still sits under Crown authority. Look at your own lands back on your pā. Who controls it? County councils. County councils control it because the majority settler population control the economy. But they regulate the land. It's no mistake that Tuahiwi is really a place for cows. 2, tino rangatiratanga is economic fiscal authority. The economic system needs to be weighted for Māori in our way. Our tribe pays a lot in rates and taxes. So all the revenue we create from building Christchurch and other places in the South Island, but I can't see any of those taxes going to our reserves. Which is why Three Waters is a good idea. We pay a lot in infrastructure, it doesn't come our way. Last point, and I think the fundamental point for any sovereignty in tino rangatiratanga is title. TAWHAI got the point. Crown title was removed. If Crown title was removed, all that's required is to assert your form of government over that land, which brings me to the point. Rangatiratanga must be built on political institutions. Thankfully, we've learnt from the last 20 years, corporations are the white shark of capitalism. It's not the white shark of political implementation. Kia ora.
Osh. Te maere, osh. Rad, thank you. Kia ora tātou. So some takeaways from the conference and some korero from where I'm standing. I really appreciated the debate between incrementalism and just do it. And I really liked the korero about country as ever present, ancient and enduring. And I think the answer, I'm not sure if Kirsty is still here, but where does tikana come from? It comes from Papatuanuku. It's the same korero. And so I just wanted to start maybe by asking this question of like, what is law? Because we're talking a lot about constitutions, law. And law, when people imagine law, they think, you know, because we're born into this colonized reality, right? We're like fish swimming in water, and we're swimming around, and that's our normal. And it's not until water's pointed out to us that we realize, oh, that's actually doesn't have to be this way. And so law, in most people's minds, you'll picture a police car or a court or a giant book full of long words, or even a place like this, you know. But law isn't about those things. That's just a Western conception of law. Law is about how we relate to each other and how we relate to the whenua in particular. And so in a Western system, how we relate to the whenua is we commodify it. We call it all property, and we become owners, and it's a hierarchical system. And so now we've diminished this ancient, breathing earth into my piece of land that I own, that I have rights to extract from, I have rights to dispose into. I can sell it like any other household item. Right? But in tikana, under our indigenous legal systems, from what I've learned and been listening to, we don't relate as owners to property. We relate as children to Papatuanuku, children to a mother. And so we don't have property rights to extract and dispose into. We have obligations of care and of whakapapa and of sharing. So the question becomes, how do we share space together peacefully over time and over difference? And I really appreciated Val, Napoleon, your korero about co-presence and radical coexistence on that point. And so I see our mahi at the moment that we've got two missions in Aotearoa, and one of them is called decolonisation, and that is all about really fighting against colonial systems that treat our land as if it's property, that pick it up when it's contaminated and dump it as if it's rubbish. It doesn't see that it's alive and an ancestor. And same with natural resources, relegating our tuakana of rākau and manu to just resources and just describing it as that, really minimising and taking away the mana of these living entities. And so I think decolonisation is about fighting against these colonial systems. It's the frontline work. It's exhausting work. We have campaigners in this room, organisers. They're out there doing that sort of mahi. But it's also really, really necessary to engage. And I know that's this sort of incrementalism. And I suppose one good example is, Te Maire, what you offered of the Te Uruwera Act, which is from where I'm from Te Uruwera. It's a rainforest just at the heart of the ika of Maui. About 4 hours south of here, for those that haven't yet been there. And she's 200,000 hectares, big rainforest, and she was a national park. And in 2014, she became a legal person. And so she was no longer owned by the state and managed by a human. She became what she's always been, which is a living, breathing ngahere. And now that has been set under legislation, so it exists under this Western legal system. But what's been created by that act is space to create te kawa o te uruwera, or our own exercise of mana motuhake in that space. So it's like acting as a shield for us to now remember what it means to hold authority and to make decisions in accordance with our values on that whenua. So even though it's existing within this Western space, it's actually created space for us to be mana whenua and to act with mana motuhake in that space. And that comes with a lot of debate. And so the other mission, if this one's decolonisation, the other mission that I see for us as Māori is reconnection, and reconnecting to ourselves and remembering physically, mentally, our wairua, who we actually are. We don't have to define ourselves in relationship to our colonisation. We had mana motuhake for millennia, and these last 170 years are like a blip compared to that. We have to remember what that feels like, and that means that we have to trust ourselves, fall back in love with ourselves. We have to believe in our mana motuhake and believe that it's right. And I think that we're in an era now, 2022, where we can start to say no, and we can start to exercise that voice, and I think that's what Reconnections is about. But that's not all. It's also about healing, because we've been colonised and we have colonial habits, and we need to identify those within ourselves, and then we need to remember what are the things about ourselves that make us tūhoi o ngā tiawa o te arawa o Ngāi Tahu.
All of those that have struggled without end, for the joy of ensuring that their status as the Indigenous peoples of the lands that they didn't inherit, that they are intimately connected to, should be continued as part of any future of those nations, not because the kāwanatanga or the governments that we coexist with permit that, but because it's morally right that the tikanga, the first laws of those nations, are respected in the way that we give force to the radical coexistence that we share, not only with human beings, but with those parts of the environment, of the cosmos, of the country that we heard from our Aboriginal sisters yesterday, that we are intimately connected to and cannot escape. One of my favourite spokespeople, Eva Rickard, always used to say that my destiny is in my past. And all of us in here have been reminded, I think, by so many different speakers, how in this land, Aotearoa, our destiny is actually cemented, embedded in the past. Starting with he whakaputanga, if you want to look at constitutional documents, and its sister document, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, but going further back to the cosmos, and the values that actually set limits on the human behaviours to avoid the exploitation of capitalism that is actually destroying the planet, that is sending us into an existential crisis so that we actually may not coexist with anybody in a radical or even a conservative way if we don't change our behaviours and the way we develop relational objectives, values, laws, philosophies and practices that give force to that whakapapa, that fact that we come after those that protect the realms of the winds, the air, the sounds, the earth, the waters, the trees. We come after them, so we are not superior to them. We are to be guided by the limits that that whakapapa framework itself has set for us in the cosmos, and that determines the kinds of laws and power dynamics relational between and amongst ourselves to guide us in the future. Those are the reminders that I want to start my korero with today. What were the three things I took out of this hui? There's more than three things. It was really lovely as a radical activist who actually is straitjacketed by the participatory framework that I've chosen to do, reminded by Annie in the first speech of our session, is that land, language and leadership will be the triggers to guide us to the constitutional transformation that the Tiriti o Waitangi he whakaputanga, and can I dare say the philosophies which are embedded deeply in the hearts and minds of most communities that give force to values of kindness, of gentleness, of cooperation, of caring for and looking after, of being connected to, guide all of us, but get forgotten in the lawmaking powers of this land as they determine, I think I enjoyed the last speaker's suggestion, the narrow interest sectors of those that promote different models of development that actually forego those values. I want to remind too, when we talk about land, that we're not just talking about a commodity. We're not just talking about a property. And our Aboriginal sisters yesterday, you hit me in the voiceless, the reminders of those that have the voiceless but actually have the greatest intimacy of connection to your country. to the cosmogony that guides your country, to the fact of that reality of connection, intimately connected to your soul. So you want to ensure that the intergenerational feeding of futures is sourced from that deep understanding, that deep ingraining of knowledge. I want to remind that when I heard the Malaysian speaker yesterday, that the native acts that you are trying to tinker with are the same kinds of strategies of manipulation that we were confronted with by the introduction of native land acts that stole our land, that actually did so without legitimacy, and then tried to contort those dynamics of our land ownership into individualised property models that were foreign and still remain foreign to our own very psyche. And I had a real empathy when I heard of your struggle to look at even at adaptation of existing legal processes so that you can actually fight for the protection of things to enable cultivations in areas where wāhi tapu are to actually be respected and cared for as a legitimate act of protection of that part of the planet where those Malaysian populations are living. I just, that was what land came out for me. But then I want to go to the second thing of language. I mean, the Canadian speaker spoke to my heart again. I was the lawyer that took the claim for the te reo Māori to become an official language of our country in the Waitangi Tribunal, another straitjacket example of my efforts in incrementalism. And, it was a great thing to hear yesterday that the markers of our own liberation are deeply embedded in the markers in our own language. And so the liberation theories, I think, of the future for us as we reclaim our country again to be that which is guided by our values, is going to be a nation that is bilingual, that is bidural, that does not have to apologise or actually seek permission for the use of our language in anything. I mean, I want to pay a big shout out to Ruby Tui, everybody, quite apart from the fact she won but in that single moment in time, she turned around in her glory to ask for support from a nation to sing with her empathy in our language about something that could unify us in that radical coexistence that sometimes we choose not to accept in our country. I also want to talk about the language of the coloniser in the courts process, and I've got to keep quiet here, Jane, because I think I have to do it in the Alice part of this. But, why should Pākehā judges be given the right to balance out what is right in tikanga terms when those judges don't even speak the reo? When they actually need a translator for the pukenga reports that are being presented to them, so that those reports are in English and not in the first tongue of those that would write those reports, why should they be given the authority to be final determiners of it? And no disrespect to you, Justice Williams, I'm sorry that when you say that the destination is forever moving, I think there's a mountaintop that we all know is called Tino Rangatiratanga, and it's really easy to get to that mountaintop if you actually share power and you recognise that there is things that are beyond your competency as a judiciary that actually should be given to another group, a Māori Law Commission to determine as a final outcome for, rather than something that should be determined by those ultimately protected to actually promote the state apparatus to which they work for. 2 minutes, okay? The other thing that I learned from this hui, okay, and because I'm only talking about the hui, I'm not giving you my ideas yet, okay? Okay, it's leadership. And I want to thank every single one of you that have come here today. We are disruptors. We are lovers. We love what we do. We love the philosophies we believe in, the philosophies we've yet to uncover, the ones we've recovered. We are I think leaders in the thought processes, but we also leaders in action. I'm sorry, I'm a lot of humbug with a lot of thought, you know. I'm really sick of armchair revolutions, that revolutionaries of the academic kind that go girl, you do it at home. You know, Mr. Tau talked about tinoranga tiratanga is going to happen because Ngāi Tahu's going to make it happen. Well, I'm sure Ngāi Tahu would like some of you academics going down there to actually shape what this new world is going to be. Not wait for someone else to provide it for you so you can critique it and say what's wrong with it. You know, so you've got to actually have pragmatism in your leadership. Not just write about it, actually action it. And all of the presentations that I saw this week, I think there was that element of activism that is so fundamental to shifting, even if you're in a stasis reality or you're in the dream world of revolutionary action, but you must have organisation and action to make that a reality. I want to finish this part in terms of leadership by saying that we're on the cusp of a moment of time. It was a cusp that Te Puia foresaw in her time. It was something that Ratana spoke about in his time. It was something that was talked about at the Pukawa Hui when they developed an alternative to a constitutional monarchy when they made the kingitanga. And that is, there is an awakening that's happening in Aotearoa. It's built on mutual respect and understanding. You know, yeah. Whanaungatanga, manaakitanga. But it must be actualised. And it must be given force because there must be a commitment. And Māori, we can't escape this. The leadership vests with us. This is our country. And we must lead that dynamism of change. And it must start at hapu. I'm a hapu fundamentalist. Everybody knows that. Because it's those communities that are closest to listening to what our Mother Earth, Ranginui, our Sky Father, wants us to be mindful of in the way we limit our behaviours so that the existential climate change crisis that threatens the whole planet will actually be averted by those connections. Kia ora.
Kia ora tātou I te whare, me ngā mihi ki te ātāhuatanga o tō tātou kaupapa. So firstly, just want to quickly acknowledge the home peoples of this place. Rātou te hunga riti ana ki a koro Joe, kururihe e Annette. You know, those who past and present are spiritually and politically supporting our work, you know, as we are here at this conference. I just also wanted to quickly thank Claire and her crew. You may not know whānau, but Claire was on our breakfast news show yesterday morning and explained that the conference was about sharing ideas from across the globe so that we might be inspired. And well done, Claire, you made it sound very moderate. And reasonable whānau, and that's exactly what we want, but certainly I know that has been the case for me, whānau, incredibly inspired. I've been watching online from my home in the Manawatu, and so really great to be here. So my name's Ronnie. I'm from the Ngāti Porou and Ngāti Uipohatu nations on the East Coast, and I'm in general what you would call a treaty educator, if there was a term that we were using. So I work part-time in academia and then part-time in communities, and then also as of late, because I see some of you here, part-time in the public service doing treaty work. And yes, whānau, incredibly small country here, Aotearoa, so you'll be surprised the rooms that we can get ourselves into. And so my job here in the Mātiki Mai movement has been focused on education, has been focused on that conscientisation aspect and really raising people's awareness levels and connecting to all those things that we might already know inherently, you know, for the purposes of action. Because as anyone here in Aotearoa will be able to tell you, you know, we have a major issue, whānau. And that is that the Crown has been able to perpetuate this large-scale level of ignorance that is absolutely preventing us from being able to get to inequality debate. And so I myself, you know, I have my own views as to what a future constitution should look like, and they are Mātiki Mai ones. You know, so kawa, tikanga, he whakaputanga, te tiriti, you know, and the UNDRIP. But for me, the whole issue is that we can't even have a quality or decent debate, about this in wider Aotearoa because of how the Crown education system has continued to perpetuate this level of ignorance that's really plagued by these myths whānau. And so my particular concerns and my particular interest and what I was going to comment on, particularly for you, our manuhere that have come from overseas, is just with regards to this education conscientisation focus. So the first point of my 3 takeaways, the first point that I had is that I really wanted to mihi to Angela Riley from the Potawatomi people, if you're here, sis. Yeah, she spoke about how most Americans do not know. Most Americans do not know, and then talked about these myths that on one end, these extinction myths, right through then to these wealthy Indigenous people myths. And whānau, what I can tell you from doing this work every day, once a week we do a 2-week workshop with, everyday New Zealanders, is that same. New Zealanders simply don't know. And for all our manuhere, our visitors from overseas, and particularly here in Aotearoa, there are 2 myths that are absolutely plaguing us, and that is on one hand, the noble savage, and then on other one, the white saviour. Okay? And I know I don't have to explain those to you, but I do just want to reflect upon the ways that those myths manifest that have been discussed at this conference. For example, so what we're seeing in terms of white saviorism is that, oh yes, we'll have your reo, we'll have your language, because it's actually us who are going to save it. And we've also seen, and yes, we'll have some of your tikanga, because we recognise that at law, as law, aren't we so wonderful? But then in terms of actually Māori ourselves, so we'll have your reo and we'll have your tikanga, but we won't have you. We won't have the actual real living person, people, and all the authority and power and stewardship that then comes with that. And so this is how whānau as well, that all those things, they're not constitutional developments, those are settler moves to innocence. This is about that constant seeking out of identity, in a way that removes us from that colonial past, but actually just continues with the same power relations that we have. And this is why those myths, particularly, on that hand of the noble savages, that no, you don't have constitutional ideas or concepts from this land, that you're just hakas and hangis and hungis, is what we call it here in Aotearoa. That's what you're down to. And so as long as that dynamic and these myths are in place, whānau, we're never going to be able to progress this constitutional conversation, because it's actually about people knowing that we are entire societies with spiritual, political concepts that, as Mona would say, is born from this land, and that we don't need overseas models. We need something that was here birthed in this land, as he said. So the second takeaway that then I had from from the conferences, I wanted to mihi to Megan Davis from our Australian cohort. Yeah, just, thank you so much, sis, for your korero. I so resonated with that. And in particular, one of the challenges that we've had here, Mātike Mai, is she talked about the need to suspend your belief that the country can't be changed. Suspend your belief that the country can't be changed. Huge, huge issue for us. Because anyone who knows, Pāmona and Ani's work, Ani Makairi's work, they talk about that one of the most insidious, destructive aspects of colonisation has been that it has killed our faith in ourselves. Not just the knowledge that those things are there, but even our faith in ourselves. And so this is how it all then manifests when we have these constitutional korero, that, is that having that belief that things can get better. And another thing that I loved from Megan's korero about the Uluru statement, the correct Uluru statement, is one of the pakeke on there saying, denial is no solution. Denial is no solution. And so that part of the 3-pronged approach they have is that one is about, a truth commission. Yeah, so incredibly exciting. And here in Aotearoa, for you overseas manuhere, here in Aotearoa, I think that is what the Waitangi Tribunal was sort of meant to be. But anyone, who's actually been a part of that tribunal process, established 1975 whānau, is that, all that korero has remained within that Crown, hapu iwi relationship, and it hasn't made it out to the wider public. You know, it's exactly like treaty settlements, and people wonder why we still have really overt racist views when we're, you know, spending millions of dollars on treaty settlements, but then not $1 on explaining to New Zealand citizens why. You know, it really is quite a setup, whānau, and so, you know, we must strategise towards this truth that she was talking about, Megan. Just loved that. You know, and particularly because it's from this truth, whānau, that we are going to be set free from those myths. Because what people do know about Māori communities, you know, in terms of overrepresentation across all the negative statistics, incarceration, etc., well, you know, they need to know where that type of thing came from, the very basics. You know, they need to know that our parliament did discuss genocide. You know, they need to know that when they couldn't afford genocide, that this is when actually one of the constitutional transformation things changed in terms of we introduced the 4 seats. You know, the 4 Māori seats in our parliament weren't started as some benevolent trying to include the Māori voice. You know, they were specifically about oppressing our rangatiratanga to then only become a part of Kāwanatanga. You know, and that along at that same time, in terms of when the Native Schools Act that banned Te Reo Māori, so banned our Māori language, you know, that also prevented Māori from studying academic subjects. You know, and why is that? Because as Professor Ranginui Walker put it, the vision was that we were to be the servant class. You know, the servant class on our own lands. You know, and how long did that policy last for? Well, of course, some people argue it's still in place, you know, but it's at least 100 years, whānau, at least 100 years. And so if people, you know, that this is the type of truth-telling that can set us free, because then people can be in a space where it's like, right, you know, we have these awful, you know, things that have happened, and we all must commit to our healing.
What that means is eventually, and tikanga does need to be studied in the same way that law needs to be studied. But it's not simply an abstract academic thing. I'll give an example. On our island in Pohawaitai in 2008-9 thereabouts, we went there. One of the families destroyed 120 holes where the birds were, really destroyed the environment. Then they crossed over into other manu, which our families have boundaries. Family hui, no, the hapu hui was held on the island. My brothers and I walked in and Mum said, get out. Grown men in their 40s told to get out. Following that, the elders on the island made the decision to banish the family for life. Gone. Now, there's a whole bunch of precedents in that tikanga exercise that requires study. And I do think it requires study because fundamentally they're looking after the environment. Now, there's lessons to be learned. Also, tikanga in our tribe and where we are, the children have no rights. Don't ever think just because you turn 18 in our tribe you have a right. You don't. The right rests with the kaumātua. So we went through all of this process, but what I'm trying to say is the tribe's been aware of this, and I can't talk too much because we have our hui this week. But in the end, what's required is that the hapu and the iwi take control of the language and are precise in what it means for tikanga. Here's the process we are not going down. The worst thing that can be done is to codify tikanga. Everyone asks for it. It just drives me up the wall, particularly at the marae. What's really more important, and what we've found, is that we know the body where tikanga sits now. What is required is that they define it, that they declare it. Really what happens down home, a kaumātua and upoko declare the kawa. They declare the tikanga. That's what you follow. What we'll do next is give the explanatory context with the tikanga on what explains it, on what it is and what it is not. I suspect one of the 3 important things that will need to be dealt with tikanga issues for iwi and hapu is who you are, where your takiwā is, and what you're about. Who you are, because there's really 3 requirements for tino rangatiratanga and yourselves as a people, and the tikanga provides the answer. You need to know who you are. And that means knowing who you're not. we need to know what the boundaries are of the tikanga and what it is specifically. You'll notice the Crown has used this word kaitiakitanga. I don't know what it means anymore. We're not using it. But there are specific words to each hapu that you will know. Those need to be categorised, and that's what we're going through an exercise at the moment to explain them. We'll probably go straight to the key word for us, which is tangata whenua, because who you are as a people is important. We'll define who it is, who it's not, but that's really what we find ourselves doing is what lawyers do. You go through your own case studies. The tribe's going through its own tikanga, its own pepeha, those types of things to explain it. Now, ultimately where this goes to is it has to be formally legitimated through the tribe. Because to do that, you control your own language, your own tikanga, not others. Finished.
I'm not too sure what the question is now. I'm lost in the evolution of, or the reclamation of our tikanga. I've already written quite extensively about the risks associated with the incorporation of Māori law, tikanga, into Pākehā law. And I think those risks are very real, and we even recognised by the Chief Justice herself, Justice Winkelman, in the Ellis case, because I think there was a reluctance on her part to be prescriptive or to define tikanga. But I think there's a deeper issue that arises, and that is, if Māori is the first law of this country, why has it been invisibilised, other than those places where it is safe to be practiced? But then, is it safe to be practiced? And I'll use my own example. I was meant to have broken everybody's cover this year because I was a Māori woman. I spoke on the Pai at the invitation of Moana Jackson. There are 3 tapu that I grew up with. One was father was alive, the son never spoke. If an older relation, male, was alive, a younger relation never spoke. In all of my life, I've seen those 2 tapu broken almost at every occasion that I've attended on Māori functions. The 3rd tapu is that women should not speak. And there are reasons for all of those tapu being in place. But because of the colonial construct and the Victorian ideas that women were chattels, we have had a much more difficult road to challenge why the time has come for the change for that kawa, particularly in the context of the colonisation that has ravaged the status of Māori women and their children by the very fact of their practices of deconstruction of our values and those philosophies that give strength to the peoples that we are. So that's an idea for me around our law, how it should be adapted, it needs to be changed, and it was done in a Māori setting. But there were efforts before that, I can say, in the Māori Land Court, for example, where a judge who's now passed away wouldn't appoint a Māori woman trustee to a trust from TAWHAI, because they said the kawa of TAWHAI did not enable women to be decision makers. And there was another case where the Te Arawa Trust Board, despite a democratic process of election, refused to enable Kathy Jews to be appointed as the first Māori woman to be selected as a tribal spokesperson for her peoples of Ngāti Rangitahi, to join them in the decision-making authority of that trust board, which went to the High Court. And that was a case I was also involved with. But I just want to talk about the constraints that our own tikanga has been so influenced by because of the process of colonisation. Moana Jackson thought carefully about all of the conundrum of this, and he advocated in his report, He Whai Pānga Hau, that a Māori Law Commission was required to astutely defend and define what law is, what tikanga is, and when appropriately or not, for it to be used as part of arguments for the Western legal framework. And if you read the Ellis decision, and you don't want to read all the legal stuff, go straight to the back. There's a really good affidavit statement there from some pukenga that also has that precautionary statement in that you need to be careful when you start to take our tikanga to the general courts for determination by people who may not have the necessary experience, expertise, or even capacity to understand the values that are being promoted. What we also have to, I think, recognise, and this is a whakapapa I talked about, is that in he whakaputanga and in Te Tiriti, whakaputanga contemplated we as Māori would go to the north in the summer and make our own laws. Remember, we would make the opportunity for the hapu to do that. We haven't done that for a while, but I can tell you in the Hirangi Hui, when they developed a law that said we didn't own natural resources or had no intimacy to it, 5,000 of us gathered at Hirangi to challenge the assumption by the Crown, who were developing policy that was nonsensical in that way, to set limits on that relationship. And that was a time when we as Māori stood up and refused to bow to the stupidity of that law, but also use the opportunity, look at ways that those relational arrangements between and amongst ourselves could be given strength to, like Taito Pounamu, to protect those resources that are essentially intimately connected to us. Okay, 1 minute to go. Ture Māori has hierarchies of obligations too, that I think I spoke about earlier, which is one of the things I've got. It was lovely to hear, actually, so many voices from different parts of the planet saying that. And the hierarchies of obligations are where the values will actually determine the extent of human organisation, and that we would limit our behaviours in accordance with those values. And I agree with what Tamaira has just said, that's a really important effort for any Māori jurist to do with their own people, is to reclaim what those hierarchy of values are and ask themselves, are they actually being given force, or are they actually being substituted by introduced colonial constructs? A classic one for Te Arawa men I'd like to close on is, why do you wear shoes into the wharenui and women don't? Kia ora.
Kia ora. And so just the last brief question that I want to put to our other two members of the panel. Just, one of the things that we're wanting to focus on in this panel is how do we take some of the discussion, all of the discussion and the reflections from this korero, and how do we turn that into action? What are the steps we need to take? So the question I'm going to put to Matariki and Ronnie is, what are those key actions for the next 5 years?
Oh, cool. Kia ora no whānau. Kia ora, mō te pātai. Okay, cool. So key action points over the next 5 years to get us on the road, chugging along, getting there, mana motuhake hardcore. So one thing I really want to see is, and this is talked about conscientisation, our expression of mana motuhake. And so I think that we need to empower and tautoko our artists and our musicians and our healers and our gardeners and our educators to translate the korero that we've been talking about over these last amazing 3 days with our amazing manuhiri into images and waiata and korero that we can then carry forward and share with any age, any stage, because that's the cultural shift that we're trying to move from, this colonised reality back to a mana motuhake reality. And so I just want to acknowledge via Auntie Linda Munn, who was one of the co-creators of the Tino Rangatiratanga flag. How many of us have been able to unite under that image, that flag, and hold that under, as an identifier and as something that we draw inspiration from and kaha from when we're feeling low? I think that's a really important part of this next 5 years, is tautoko our artists and our healers. The other thing I think is, our hoho te rono processes. I really would like to see more of our peacemaking circles. I think when we of society, we are of course going to have conflict. And there aren't many places that I've seen within our communities, and I'm talking back home, where we can come together with the inherent interest of keeping our relationship intact. And part of the colonial process is to have adversarial court systems where we're just scrapping and separated from each other. And so, these peacemaking circles, hohau te rono, ways of coming together and resolving conflict within our own tikana, I want to see that in the next 5 years. I think that would be really important. Keep us together, keep us connected, bring people home, help us reconnect, but not at the expense of the ahika, eh? So there has to be a peaceful way to reconnect home without being the Johnny-come-lately with all the opinions who has no idea how to wash the dishes at the marae, which happens. And then, another point would be our Pākehā whānau, kia ora koutou. You guys got some mahi ahead of you and behind you as well, so kia ora. But there's a big effort that needs to be happening on the side of our Pākehā allies and accomplices to really take this mahi forward and speak to Pākehā and get them on board, share the korero, conscientisation. It can be a difficult thing for Māori to be the only voice sharing this korero. It needs to be held and carried by all of us, So, and finding our place, so if there's tangata whenua, then there's manuhiri. What do those roles actually mean? How do we come together? How do we find our roles within our society in relationship with each other in a way that's not guilt-ridden and paralysis, those sort of vibes, but actually uplifting and moving forward, eh? So, those are the ones I'll leave. There's other, kia ora.
Thank you. Kia ora no tātou. So just to tautoko what ERIN has said, so my concern with regards to, action moving forward really boils down to the wero that Ani had for us on the first day. And that is in particular that we cannot leave this to our children. We cannot leave this to our children, that we must normalise constitutional transformation korero in this generation, so that her particular thing is for them that it's not the if and what, but the how and when, that what is going to happen, when is it going to happen. And so just 3 really points that I had, is that first and foremost, with regards to this interdependence thing that has really disturbed me, is that first and foremost, whānau, all of you that are still keen to, go and fight in that kāwanatanga sphere, so in that crown sphere, because that sphere does need decolonising, all those myths that we were talking about, the institutions of those process of truth, finding, anyone that has the energy for all of that, please continue to go and do that. Because there's so many strategies and layers that we need, in that space, to definitely do that. But the other thing, of course, that we've been talking about, and which you mentioned, Claire, in your first, in the opening address, was that the rangatiratanga sphere, though. The spheres that, as Queen Val Napoleon is talking about, that we might retreat to for safety. That those things really need building up. So, my babies go to a te aho matua school. So for you overseas visitors, there's a Māori, people call them Māori language immersion, but it's really Māori philosophy immersion schools. The language is just the vehicle. And as a safe space that is constantly accused of being separatist, as a Māori mother, I'm really grateful for that space. Because I can sleep at night and be here during the day knowing that my children are safe, from racism, from prejudice, and that actually, the entire environment that they are in is one that recognises them as spirits and souls, and that the environment has to be one that really nurtures that. And so I think, but sometimes it's difficult here in Aotearoa because, Te Aho Matua and Kura Kaupapa is one of the only examples that we have. So I'd really love to see some amazing radical developments, in that space where we really start seeing something else. And I know the Crown's talking about a Māori Health Authority whānau, but I don't know if it's going to be in that, you know what I'm saying? So, we really need to continue to build our own whānau. And then the third thing really that's connected to all of that, and anyone who knows me, knows I'm an educator, knows I have a huge bias for teaching and learning, is that, and then for the rest of Aotearoa whānau, for the rest of Aotearoa that might not be, consciously fighting in the kāwanatanga space, or might not be, building up our rangatiratanga spaces, what is the plan? What is the plan to connect to those people to ensure that they are contributing? And I know that sometimes the korero, I think Minister Mahuta's comment was, taking them with us. But for me, it's like the opposite of that. It's not taking them with us. It's us connecting to them, because that's where it is. They are us, we are them. That's where the ideas are. That's where the knowledge is. This is where together, whatever this future constitution is going to look like, we're going to build. And so we need a massive conscientisation strategy, whānau. What is that? What is the plan? And certainly, and it can be in even little ways, whānau. Yesterday I had a, Indian taxi driver who asked me what I do. And by the end of our ride, he was off to learn te reo so that he can do a correct translation of te tiriti or waitangi into Hindi. 1 15-minute taxi ride, whānau. I'm telling you, we can do it. And so it really is about that empowerment in terms of what are the everyday ways, that we can actually do what Ani is saying, normalising this constitutional transformation korero. And I don't want to be one of those cheesy people that, if you just tell 5 people a day about, but if you just tell 5 people a day about constitutional transformation, okay? Because this is it. This is what it means to be Māori, is that everyone that can contribute. That we have our tikanga and kawa, but that we're inclusive whānau, and that everyone has their bit to play, and we welcome that. And he's talking about translating it into Hindi, and I'm thinking of all these fabulous Hindi, Māori sovereignty, solidarity movements into the future, all these Māori Hindi kids that are going to come for it, because that's all the Māori aspect to it. But this is it, whānau, we can do it. And we know, this is time. It's the time.